This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek Podcast for the Living the Wildlife podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and/or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here.
Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. Really glad to have you on board, and again, always hoping that you had a great last week. And do take a few moments, if you would, to make sure you subscribe to the channel and put the little bell on if you're looking at it with YouTube, or if you're coming on to Rumble to find my particular video. You can find that on Wildlife Control Consultant on the Rumble world as well. And do reach out to me if you could at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. If you have a topic idea, something that you would like to have covered, I would love to hear from it. Or if you just want to give a shout out, we'd love to hear from you. Sometimes I had a chance to meet people at various events, two in particular that I'm thinking of. One in New York and then one at the VPC. They weren't even in the country, so it was kind of interesting to have them reach out to me, and it's amazing to sort of hear that kind of feedback. So this week I wanted to talk a little bit about dealing with the government, and basically what I'm wanting you to understand, especially as the spring seasons often kicks off, and that really makes you busier than normal. I know some of you are basically full on all year round. However, for many people in the United States and elsewhere, the spring birth pulse and mating area and that sort of thing, those are times where there's a lot more phone traffic, and you're often time crunched, where you're putting in some of those 12, maybe even 15-hour days for an extended period of time, because that is your money season. Want to talk a little bit about, again, dealing with the government. Now, for some of you, that means two specific agencies. That would be your game warden, the wildlife agency for your particular state. I'm talking within an American context, although it's similar, I believe, in Canada as well. Other countries may have different regulations and rules, but I think you can apply this pretty much anywhere. But I'm going to be specifically talking about an American context, where your game warden is certainly the one that's going to be enforcing wildlife laws. Now, typically speaking, wildlife agencies govern seasons of animals, which animals may be taken without a license, or those that require a license, as well as the tools and methods by which you can take those animals. Departments of Agriculture, on the other hand, or if you have a pesticide bureau or department in your state government, they manage, of course, pesticides. That's usually regulated ultimately at the EPA level by that's the Fed. And so you can be dealing with two different agencies if you have both a wildlife control operator's license and a pesticide applicator's license. And so there can be two different agencies that you have to deal with. And so the principles here apply to both. And I really want to encourage a few simple tips. Number one, make it a point to follow the law. It's one of the challenges in our industry, because in wildlife control, time is such an important commodity, and it's really an element that restricts the growth within our industry. This is one of the things I really envy about the pest control industry. I'm going to hear complaints probably from the pest control industry. We're stressed for time too. Yes, but not to the same way as a wildlife control operator. Wildlife control operators are, if they're often using traps, although that's certainly changing within the industry, they have to go back and remove that animal. You, with a pesticide, don't always have to go back and remove that particular cockroach. Or if you're using a rodenticide for a rodent, they may die in the walls and not be accessible, or there may not even be an odor. So because you have that pesticide doing the work for you to kill that organism or repel that organism, sometimes both. But for a wildlife control operator, You have to get out there, identify what the animal is, of course, and you have to put in the appropriate trap at the appropriate location and often remove that animal and then dispose of the carcass, where that is an extra piece of work that's not that typical for those of you in the pest control world. So in light of that, for wildlife control operators, there's always pressure to cut corners. Let's give a few illustrations. For example, you have a woodpecker that's pecking your client's house. You're putting up the frightening devices, for example, and the client is really getting heated and upset, and you're like, well, you know what? I'll just shoot it. Now you're supposed to get a federal permit to use lethal control, but that you also know that permit requires your customer to pay $100. And you need to move on, or you feel you need to move on. And the client, the client may go to some other less reputable company or your competition, or he's going to shoot it himself. And you don't want to make him mad because maybe you're financially stressed, or you have an excessive desire to meet people's needs or make them happy. And so you just shoot it. Shoot, shovel, and shut up. I want to really encourage you to resist that temptation. And it can be very strong temptation, particularly when you are time stressed. Now, there's a myriad other examples: not checking traps appropriately, making sure that you may be dumping animals when your state does not allow you to translocate animals, or it may require you to be, where it may allow you to relocate and translocate some animals, but not others, and you just translocate all of them. I'm just going to encourage you, know what the laws and regulations are in your state. Follow them to the letter. And I encourage you to be sure that when you have your corporate brochure, those who have been listening to this podcast know that I've mentioned this in earlier editions, and that is, have a handout that you're giving to your clients that explains some of the laws within your state. And that can do a lot of things for you. One, it gives you political cover, and also helps expose the fraud that maybe your competition is doing, or when they're lying. I certainly did this when I was in business in Massachusetts, where I had clients who told me, well, the other guy said they could release the animal. I says, well, they're either lying to you or they're simply breaking the law. So I didn't have to throw the person under the bus. I just had to hand the client information that was published by the state that said translocation of wildlife was against the law. Pretty simple. So if you want to have a good relationship with the government, follow the law. Now, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that we shouldn't be politically active to try to change the law. One of my pet peeves about the wildlife control industry is that we have not worked hard enough to change regulation. Now, there's some complex reasons for that. I'm not insensitive to that, but I also know that other people or other organizations are able to get things changed their way, and they're minority groups as well. And when I mean minority, I'm not necessarily referring to ethnicity, referring to whether it be, computer programmers or whatever. It can be job, it can be ethnicity, it can be sexuality, it can be a whole religion, it can be a whole host of things. It doesn't matter. Whatever you are, whatever is not the majority within the population that you're dealing with, you can, as a minority group, and certainly wildlife control operators are a minority group. There are not a lot of us in the nation, period. We have failed in doing a good job lobbying government. And there's various reasons for that, and I understand that it's hard. But we haven't. So I'm not suggesting by just simply following the law that means you just have to suck it up and follow the law, although I'm saying that, but you also have the ability to change the law, and I'm certainly encouraging. What I don't want you to do is simply say, the law sucks, I'm just going to break the law and exempt myself anyways. That is not the answer. So number one, follow the law. Number two, reach out to your enforcement individuals, whether it be your game warden and whether it be your pesticide enforcement officer as well. Reach out to both of them. If you're dealing with pesticides, definitely reach out to your pesticide or agent, as well as and then if you're dealing with wildlife, also reach out to your game warden. Why do you need to do that? Because relationships matter. It does two things for you. Number one, they get to know you. And if they get to know you as someone that is trustworthy, that helps them feel better when it comes to whether they have a question or if they have a complaint against you, what that can involve. One of the challenges, another one of the challenges when we have many of them that we have in the wildlife control industry is I'm not convinced that game wardens truly understand what you do for a living. And you know, that makes sense because they're trained to handle, you know, sporting events, you know, sporting issues, whether it be hunting deer or fishing or fur trapping, right? And even then, in the fur trapping, I had one guy tell me he knew more about trapping regulations than the game warden. Makes perfect sense. There aren't a lot of trappers out there. So when it comes to wildlife control in an urban setting, how often do you see a game warden driving down, you know, I'll just use some sarcastic thing like downtown Manhattan, right? How common would that be? Well, probably not very common at all. So by reaching out to that particular agent, to your game warden, you build those relationships. And so now he knows who you are, and just invite him or her and say, look, why don't you come out and do a ride along with me for 4 hours? They might enjoy it, particularly if it's a slower time of the year. Now, if it's deer hunting season, that's probably not going to be a good time to do it because deer, of course, is a major revenue generator for most game agencies in the United States. Probably, you know, the first day of, you know, fishing, you know, open day for fishing, that's probably not a good day either. But probably something, you know, maybe late February, early March, maybe something in the dog days of July. Those would probably be some good days to say, you know, can I help you understand what I do and to see the complexities to do that? Now, I'm encouraging you to do that for not only the enforcement folks, but also your state biologist, your wildlife biologist. Now, they probably won't take you up on it, but it's valuable to ask and to invite them and to reach out to them and do this every year. Put it on the calendar and just say, you know what, we're going to offer this to come out to you. We're going to do this every year. We're going to invite you to come out and do it. And just make it a standing opportunity, saying, you know, when you get some time, maybe they're going to find out that the next day is there going to be free time. Come out and do a ride along with me. Let them see your operation. Now, you can only do that if you're confident you're following the law, right? Otherwise, you're inviting the fox into the hen house, right? So that's not very smart, but you have to have that kind of confidence. And that matters. When you have that level of confidence that you're like, you know what? I'm not ashamed of what I'm doing. I am proud of what I'm doing. I want to expose you to what's going on, and I want to show you as a game warden, here's some, and this gives you the opportunity to ask the game warden legal questions. How does the game warden understand this particular regulation? Because no matter how well you write a regulation or a law, it still has to be interpreted because there's going to be quote unquote gray areas for how that's going to be defined, how certain issues are going to be defined and enforced. I'll give you an illustration from my home state of Montana. Many pesticides prohibit the use on residential lawns. Well, how do you define what a residential lawn actually is, particularly out here in Montana, where a home may be on 40 acres or more? What if you have a ranch? I talked to one ranch owner. His ranch was 15 miles in size. I could hardly even fathom that number. So is all of that property residential? Residential lawn? Well, of course not. But how do you distinguish when the lawn ends and pasture begins? We define it here as the portion of your property that you mow on a regular basis. That's residential lawn. The portion of your property that you don't mow on a regular basis, that's not residential lawn. Now, typically there's a fence there, but the point is that if you have a portion of your property that you may mow, often we call it mowing or haying, twice a year, well, that's not residential lawn. That would be pasture. Where the portion you're mowing, every week or every other week, depending how much you water it and sort of thing, but you're mowing it on a regular basis, that's residential lawn. Now, does that make sense? Now, is that perfect? Well, it's probably about as perfect as it's going to be, but it took a while for me to learn. Then I had to ask my supervisor, says, how do I distinguish between a residential lawn and a non-residential lawn? And that's what she told me. And so it's worked for me ever since. But that's sort of a policy decision that we have here in our particular state because that matters. Well, these are the types of questions that you can understand and learn more about from how your enforcement person interprets those particular things. Plus, when your enforcement person has a better grasp on the complexities of what you deal with, you never know what kind of influence that individual can have when decisions come about changing regulations. Now, changing regulations in state agencies is very slow and it doesn't happen very often. It's a long-term process, if at all. However, you want people, even if they don't agree with you, at least they can appreciate what you're up against and have some empathy with you or even sympathy with you so that they can at least make less punitive regulations. And sometimes you may even get regulations that are even a blessing for you, that are an empowering regulation. Remember, not all regulations are bad. Sometimes the people in our industry have a very negative attitude towards regulation. I say the solution to bad regulation is better regulation, not no regulation. Okay, so because saying there are no regulations is a regulation. All right, so to be a little smart with that. So invite your enforcement person to visit you in the field. So number one, follow the law. Number two, invite your enforcement person, both your game warden and your pesticide enforcement person. If you don't deal with pesticides, then obviously you wouldn't need to invite them. But you would want to invite your enforcement person on the game side, and you'd want to even invite biologists to come out with you and visit you. Why? Because they're going to be getting some of those phone calls. Reach out even to your animal control officer. Now, I would probably be a little bit more cautious about that because some animal control officers are really kind of animal rights friendly. All right, so that may be something you need to sort of judge on the basis of that, but it can be helpful to communicate. Hiding isn't always an answer, although that's what many wildlife control operators do, because they say, I'm going to be under the radar. I don't want anyone, I'm going to be stealth. So yeah, I'll advertise and do this and that, but I'm going to have stealth trucks. No one's going to know what I'm doing. And I'm going to be able to sort of skirt the law. Maybe even if they are obeying the law, they just don't want to draw attention to themselves because their attitude is that drawing attention to themselves just leads to problems. I can appreciate that particular perspective. I don't agree with it. However, I do understand it. Let me give an illustration of that. I was trying to get a particular pesticide adopted, the label expanded in my state. I reached out was working with the EPA to get that label expanded in the state, and lo and behold, the EPA said, I thought all our ducks were in a row. We're going to have our conversation, our sort of last conversation before applications were put in and everything. I'm on the phone with the EPA, and I was told, oh, you shouldn't have this. I said, well, what do you mean we shouldn't have this? And they said, well, you shouldn't have this. I said, we've had this for 10 years. Well, you shouldn't have gotten it authorized. So lo and behold, all of a sudden we lost that pesticide like that. So where if I'd have kept my mouth shut, we would have still had it probably. So because I was trying to expand the uses of that, we lost that particular pesticide. That was a learning experience. That was a painful learning experience. Okay, and because that was a product I wanted to keep, and I wanted to keep it and expand its usage in my state. However, I think that pesticides are certainly a different world than in the wildlife area, at least for now. And I do think that even if the pesticide person doesn't do a ride along with you, it's going to be good. Have them come to your shop, invite them to come to inspect your shop, because they can do informative inspections to say, look, am I storing my pesticides correctly? Is my paperwork in order? And I'll tell you, it makes a difference for someone who is saying, here I am, help me make sure that I'm following the regulations. That's going to create, I haven't met any enforcement person per se a field agent that is, who's just being a complete jerk. I've heard of it sometimes, but if you are inviting someone out, I haven't heard of anyone being a complete jerk. Now, I don't have a lot of contact per se. Maybe your experience is going to be different. But if I was enforcement, and I'm not enforcement, but if I ever had a job like that, and I had a company that said, can you come out and do an inspection on us? And I want you to, check over our paperwork, because paperwork is a pain, and it's often incomplete and not done right. And certainly pesticide storage can be a little tricky at times, and you want to be sure that you're following it, and you're inviting them in and saying, help me. Most states don't have punitive pesticide enforcement people. And what I mean by that is that they're not there to see how many fines they can levy against you. What they're designed to do is to be educational, in the sense of trying to get you to change behavior to conform to the law. So it's correctional rather than punitive. Punitive is failed, we're punishing you, go away, we're going to make sure you make your life miserable. Corrective is we're going to give you like a warning, we're going to tell you this is what you need to correct. Don't be surprised if we follow up in a month or two to see if you're following the rules. That's a corrective rather than a punitive. Now, if you don't listen to their correction, you might get the punitive, but they're not out there looking to see how many fines they can do. That's my understanding of what most state enforcement agencies on pesticides are doing. That they're not looking to jack you up. They're looking to be sure that you're conforming to the regulations. So if, in light of that, when you are inviting them into your place and saying, can you give me some insight here to make sure I'm doing things correctly, I don't see how that does anything but build trust and cooperation. And that type of trust can help, because goodwill matters. Think of it like a piggy bank. When you do good things for other people, that breeds goodwill, and that gives you some social fluid that helps smooth out those rough edges when we try to have conflicts with each other. You're like, well, I'm really angry with this person. He did something I didn't like, but he really did something good for me last time. You build some of that trust, and you can do the same thing with enforcement people. And I would certainly encourage that, or at least have you think about it. and to see if this is something that you can fit into your business, particularly if you're small and just starting out. I know you're going to be hungry for business, but you want to be sure that things are starting off on the right foot. I would wait a while if you're doing wildlife control. Wait a while to get some experience before you have the game warden come out to you. If you're in pesticide work, I would encourage you to have the pesticide enforcement come out sooner to be sure that your paperwork is in proper order. And that is something that you would want done sooner. So later for the game warden, earlier for the pesticide application. The third area is in your correspondence with government workers. Understand that sometimes government workers can be jerks. I mean, they're just human like anybody else. But you don't help yourself if you don't treat them with respect and professional courtesy. Be careful on how you speak to them, even if you're frustrated. You can watch your tone. You can watch the words. Try to avoid swear words, particularly never use a swear word at a government worker. And I know that can be hard, because especially if there's a prosecution issue or you're getting fined about something, or if you're trying to get through the phone tree, that can be maddening, of course. You can be extraordinarily frustrated trying to find someone to return a phone call. That can be very difficult, but understand that in some states, these people are understaffed, and there can be an incredible amount of phone call pressure, so it may be difficult. So if you're going to always leave a message, leave it slow and clear, give full name. If you can, the more information you can give them, the better. Email can be very powerful as well. And be sure to speak respectfully. Many states, I believe, are going to start moving more toward online licensing and this sort of thing. Make sure you have your passwords and username and just keep that. Just try not to be part of the problem. But when you are in situations where you're needing to talk to a person to get either advice or trying to get licensing taken care of, or perhaps bills or fines or whatever the case may be, always be respectful. Try to use their name and just ask yourself, how would I want to be treated? Now, if you believe you're being treated unfairly, now I want to be clear on this. It's just because you're upset with their decision, ask yourself, is this decision based on that they're being a jerk to me, or are they just simply following the regulation? That's different, right? So if you think you're being treated unfairly, well, then certainly you have the right to petition your case to maybe the supervisor or farther up the food chain within that particular agency. I'm not telling you not to defend your rights. What I'm saying is, don't shoot the messenger. Just because you're angry with this person who's on the other end of the line, or you're angry, it may not be this person that's the problem, maybe the regulation you're angry with, and you're taking it out on them. I was explaining to a homeowner once what they had to do when it came to woodpeckers. And this individual was quite agitated, and it's understandable. Their house was getting really damaged by this woodpecker. I took him at his word. I don't think he was lying to me. And I was explaining to him that he needed to get a permit to use lethal control. And he was so upset, he just hung up on me. Unfortunately, I didn't have caller ID at the time, so I couldn't call him back. And so if he'd have waited, if he'd allowed his frustration to wane a little bit and give me the opportunity to continue talking, I could have given him strategies that would have probably been better on the management of this particular woodpecker, that might have given him some relief without having to go through the struggle of filling out a permit. But I wasn't able to tell him that. The same thing could happen to you if you're getting so angry at someone and you're starting to use swear words. Many government workers are allowed to simply tell you, if you don't stop, they'll hang up. Or they may hang up before you're even finished. And that's certainly not going to be helpful for you, because when you have a rough relationship, even if the government worker's trying to treat you even-handedly, it's hard to overcome that gut reaction to them and making sure they're following the regulations, where, not everyone has the ability to simply suppress their feelings and do the job. And so you want to make sure you're not going to be talking with someone on the other end of the phone who's in a powerful position who can lose your paperwork. There's an old story I heard when in the old airline days, when a person was yelling at the counter staff at an airport, and finally the person left, and another person followed up and says, "Wow, you really handled that person really well. I'm sorry you were getting yelled at like that." And he says, "No, don't worry about it. He's going to Cleveland, but his luggage is going to Dallas." That is something you don't want to have happen to you. And those are things that can, that people can do. Why? Because people are human. And so you don't want to be that person. So let's sort of summarize here again. How are you going to deal with government? Well, number one, I'm encouraging you, follow the law. Be ethical, be legal, be upbeat, above board. Don't be afraid to lobby if you need to, but follow the law, all right? Be professional. Number two, invite enforcement out to you. Either do a ride-along if you're dealing with a game warden, come to your business location if you're in pesticides. And again, I would recommend if you're going into wildlife control, make sure you get some time under your belt in the agency before you reach out to your game wardens and agency personnel. And if you're in pesticides, I would do it sooner to be sure you're following the paper. Those are just recommendations. You certainly can differ than that. And then lastly, when you're engaging with government agencies, whether on the phone or by email or by mail, make sure you're always professional. Make sure you're watching keeping your anger under control, making sure you're watching your tone, that you're being respectful, that you're not using swear words. And you will find that this can help you enormously, avoid problems with government, but number two, that it enhances relationships, and so that if something goes awry, and I hope it doesn't, but sometimes things happen, it can give you some well-meaning and a benefit of the doubt when they know you better. And certainly the information that they get, it cuts both ways, because they may be able to then lobby for regulations or positions or policies within the agency that may be more beneficial for you, because they have a better understanding of some of the things that you're struggling with. Because remember, wildlife control is a small market, and a lot of government officials don't understand all the complexities involved in wildlife control. And by communicating with them, I believe it can help your business in a variety of ways, and making you better, and also keeping those lines of communication, because relationships can matter when you're dealing with the government. Those are some things to think about. Is it going to be Shangri-La? No. But could it be helpful? I think so. Why don't you think about it? Is there risk? Yeah, there is some risk whenever you have the fox in the henhouse. Make sure you're legal. But I haven't found a situation where you're inviting government workers to come in, and even regulatory people, and saying, look, help me follow the regs. I haven't seen situations where that is often punitive. Okay, so can it be stressful? Absolutely, but it's not necessarily punitive. And if it does become where you lose something, it's always going to be better in a voluntary situation than if they're doing, like, getting warrants and doing it on an investigation basis. That's been my understanding. Maybe your experience is different. Would love to get your comments on it. Think about it and see how you're going to go. I'd love to get your feedback. I'm Stephen Vantassel. You've been listening to Living the Wildlife as podcast as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. I'm glad to have you on board. Do take some time to reach out to me. I'd love to hear your comments on this show and other shows. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. And again, this is Living the Wildlife. Why do we call it Living the Wildlife? Because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everybody.